Well, hi again, and welcome back to another episode of Taking a Stand.
I'm Sara.
And I'm Adam. And this week we'll be talking about logic. But before we get into it, let's take a moment to pray. Dear Lord, we just come before you and ask for your guidance and wisdom. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to just explain your truths to our church and to everyone listening. And we just pray that you would give us the right words to say, that we would be honoring and glorifying to you, that we would be clear and understandable, Lord. And we just pray that we can just make your truth and your word known to everyone who hears this. And again, we thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus, and his sacrifice and death and resurrection so that we can live in eternity with you, Lord. And we thank you so much for being the God that you are. And we love you. Amen.
Amen.
So, as a recap, if you'll remember from our episode on postmodernism, we spoke about different overarching eras that account for really all of human history. And so we wanted to give a refresher on that here because it pertains a bit to our discussion about logic. And so in the pre-modern era, this was an era where belief in the supernatural was common and it was accepted. And then from there, we moved into the modern era. And this era was all about reason and logic. And so faith had a secondary role compared to Enlightenment or humanist thinking. Our current era is really mostly considered postmodern, where truth is relative, there's no absolute, and some would even argue that we're starting to enter into a postmodern era. And in this era, we might be trying to claim back some of the logic that we had lost in postmodernism, yet still disregarding it in areas like the soft sciences of humanities and the arts.
So even in a postmodern world that claims to deconstruct or defy truth and logic, we are in a situation where people still use traditional logic in everyday conversations and reasoning, but we have to ask, why would they do that? Doesn't this seem hypocritical? Well, in some cases, I think it's seen as a crutch, like something residual from the modern era that can't be shaken off. I've watched quite a few discussions where there's a conversation between a Christian and a progressive Christian. And these aren't exactly debates in some cases, but just honest explanations of differences. And if you are unaware, progressive Christianity gets a lot of their underlying concepts from postmodernism. They have the rejection of absolute truth in a lot of cases, deconstruction, linguistic changes, and so on. But that said, I'm amazed that the progressive Christian will still always try to start off by using some sort of logic to defend their case. They do this until they realize or remember that their belief doesn't always make sense logically. At some point, it's like a switch is flipped and they pull out their trump card and some kind of statement similar to this comes out, like, my belief doesn't have to make sense logically, and that's okay because logic is simply a Western construct. Or something similar where they are just okay with talking more about the path or the journey and how they're good with not having their questions answered and how they're okay to be on some sort of spectrum of hopeful agnostic. But up until that point, they are still trying to explain what they believe and why they believe it by using logic. But I still have to believe that logic is not just something that can really be truly cast off. At least I hope so. A definition of logic is reasoning conducted or assessed according to strict principles of validity. If that reasoning that is based on truth were to be cast off, our society would look truly grim because we would have to cast off all logic-based systems in our society. Sciences, engineering, law, etc.
Yeah, and we have some groups and ideologies that are trying to do exactly that. They're suggesting that right and wrong answers in, say, fields like science and math are actually controlled by an oppressor-oppressed framework. And so they suggest that certain identities have more value than others and more access to truth. But these claims are antithetical to logic, and they really seek to divide us rather than bring us together.
But overall, we see a huge contradiction in what our culture claims they want. There are very loud voices saying we need to throw off the chains of logic in regard to certain parts of culture and language and religion. And then equally loud voices, and sometimes even the same voices, upholding the value of science. This makes me feel like we don't really want to completely throw off logic, but only in the places where it becomes inconvenient or contrary to the popular narrative.
Yeah.
And the place that logic is most inconvenient is religion, because if one religion is true and another is not, then that would carry with it some huge consequences and decisions and life changes. And if you have the urge to do whatever you want and even make yourself God, then this just doesn't even work. And honestly, the modern era did such a number on the reliability of the Bible and God that it doesn't take much for the postmodern era to just discredit it without question. And as we've explained in the past, the modern era treated religion and faith and God as something to be tolerated, but still holding little to no value. If there was a God, he was distant and uninvolved. And then we have the postmodern era that says that even if it was logical to believe these things, it doesn't matter because we disavow logic. So today, postmodernism seems to be struggling with the denial of all logic and coming to terms with that. They still use logic in many parts of everyday life, but religion has been distorted and separated from logic for so long during the modern era that it doesn't even seem to be an urge to try to add religion to the short list of things that must be rationalized. And if this all sounds really super confusing, it's because it is. But suffice it to say that if we are entering into whatever postmodern era that we seem to be in right now, then we're on the precipice possibly of what can be opportunity. The purpose of logic is again being questioned or re-entertained.
Mm-hmm. So what does all of this mean for believers? If logic is being seen as possibly having more value again, then right now is the perfect time to display how the truth of logic and Christianity work together and how they're not really exclusive. You know, the common practice in today's culture in social settings is really to group everybody into classes or sides as quickly as you can so that you can determine, you know, what side they're on or what their motives are. And essentially, if you're not for something, you're against it. There's not a lot of room for understanding or any sort of overlap. There's not room for nuanced reasoning. And so when it comes to logic, it's apparently already been determined many years ago that, you know, religious belief in any form was inherently contrary to logical or scientific reasoning. So during the modern era, Christians found themselves socially on the opposite end of a spectrum, albeit a false spectrum. So today, to any secularist, when you talk about logic, you can't possibly have anything to do with religion. But the reality is that logic and the Bible are not only not at odds with each other, but they go hand in hand. The Bible is supported by logic, and its truths are based on reality. And reality, in turn, is made from a logical and orderly framework.
In fact, there have been many famous scientists throughout history, and even now, that did not see their Christianity as something they had to overcome, but something that aided them to reach the conclusions they did about reality. So we're just going to read some of these quotes that I think are just really neat to see these famous scientists that completely were good with God. They didn't see it as conflicting at all. But Isaac Newton, who developed calculus and described universal gravitation, the three laws of motion, and developed color theory, he said, the most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all, and on account of his dominion, he is wont to be called Lord God or universal ruler.
Yeah, and William Lord Kelvin, he died in 1907, but he was the inventor of the Kelvin temperature scale. He said this: "As the depth of our insight into the wonderful works of God increases, the stronger are our feelings of awe and veneration in contemplating them and endeavoring to approach their author. So will he, the earnest student, by his studies and successive acquirements, be led through nature to nature's God."
Yeah, and so actually, Lord Kelvin, I want to look more into him because something that I found when we were kind of looking up these quotes was that he was actually part of a group that fought to show that science and God science and religion, science and faith could coexist. And so I don't know much about the group, but I want to kind of look more into it. And just so you know, when we're reading these, we do understand that just because they're claimed to be Christian, it might not be exactly like the statement of faith that like our church holds to, but they still had awe and an acknowledgement of God and
a creator, that aligned with science, that aligned with order and logic.
Yeah, thank you. Another one, though, was George Washington Carver. He was an agricultural scientist and inventor. He said, "The secret of my success, it's simple. It's found in the Bible." And he also said, "I love to think of nature as an unlimited broadcasting station through which God speaks to us every hour, if only we would tune in."
And even today, a living scientist, Francis Collins, he's one of today's leading geneticists. He helped map the human genome, some 30 years ago now. He wrote a book called The Language of God. And, a quote from that book, it says, "In this modern era of cosmology, evolution, and the human genome, is there still the possibility of a richly satisfying harmony between scientific and spiritual worldviews? I answer with a resounding yes. In my view, there is no conflict in being a rigorous scientist and a person who believes in a God who takes personal interest in each one of us."
So I'm glad that I didn't have to read that one because I thought when I looked at the cosmology, I probably would have said cosmetology. Anyways, so there's rationality within the Christian worldview that doesn't reject science, but actually honors true science and logic as evidence of our perfect calculated designer. We don't see life as chaotic and random, and we don't see it through a lens of blind faith and ignorance. Romans 1:19-20 states, "Since that what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse."
And in Job 37, verses 14-16, it says, "Listen to this, Job. Stop and consider God's wonders. Do you know how God controls the clouds and makes his lightning flash? Do you know how the clouds hang poised? Those wonders of him who has perfect knowledge?"
So now, how do we apply logic? It seems in many conversations over the last few years, even ones that have claimed to be academic, have been riddled with poor logic and just rely on arrogance sometimes. They belittle and attack. They usually use exaggerated and extreme language and often put into question the other person's basic humanity or even their morality. They leave little room for actual problem solving and good communication. This can often be intimidating and very difficult to either feel like you have a voice or that you should even use your voice. I do believe that you should weigh your responses to people very carefully, though. There may be some people that you aren't supposed to address, and if the conversation is on social media, then maybe there are some better ways to have the same conversation than by posting. But you shouldn't ever be made to feel like you don't have the ability or right to understand different topics just because you may not know everything about a certain topic. For some more information on this and some encouragement, we've attached a podcast labeled "How Educated Do You Have to Be to Spot Nonsense?" It's from the Mama Bears Apologetics site, and I think that it could be really helpful.
Mm-hmm. And so we just wanted to share a little bit about different aspects of logical arguments so that we can help when addressing someone and to speak logically about our belief. Logical reasoning uses arguments to determine what is true and what is false. And just a point of clarification here, when we say argument, we don't mean the heated back and forth or the actual exchange per se, but rather the set of reasons given that form the basis of persuading someone of something. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they're the reasons why you believe a statement is true or false. So the first thing to explain about forming an argument for or against something is that you simply can't just claim things without any support. It's what's called an assertion. And that type of discussion, we see it a lot today, where someone just announces that something is true, but they don't have any support or proof for their assertion. And so by definition, without support of evidence, something can't be determined to be a fact. It could be, or it might not be. We really can't know. And so in order to better understand an actual, properly formed logical argument, we need to explain what the different parts of the argument are. And there's three basic parts to a logical argument. You begin with a premise. Sometimes you have an inference, and then you always have a conclusion. A premise is a statement or an assertion that provides reason or evidence in support of what your conclusion is going to be. They're what the argument's based on, and there can be one or more premises in an argument. And these premises are assumed generally by other people and outside of your argument to be actual facts. So, for example, all mammals are warm-blooded, all whales are mammals. Therefore, the conclusion would be that all whales are warm-blooded. Those first two parts are premises to the argument. It's important to note, though, that if your premise isn't really widely accepted or accepted by the person who you're presenting the argument to, then it's very likely that your conclusion is also going to be rejected. So it's important to really use premise statements that everyone accepts as fact. Inferences are the part of the argument that really makes the link between a premise and a conclusion. And these sometimes don't exist or aren't explicit, but in a complex argument, they're often needed. But this is where the reasoning of the argument really takes place. But it's also where the fallacy can occur. And so an inference is valid if it's based on sound evidence and the conclusion logically follows from the premise. And then finally, the conclusion. The conclusion is really a type of inference, so you can have just premises and a conclusion and you still have made an argument. But it's simply the last inference that you make in an argument. And it's a proposition that follows logically from the premises that you laid out at the beginning. And it's typically indicated by a phrase like therefore or because of. So you know that that's what the conclusion is being identified as. So some arguments, unfortunately, are not very clear or organized in this way. So you might not be able to see the parts right away. But if you can't decipher premises or conclusions in what someone is saying, then they may not really have an argument. They may just be saying stuff or asserting things. And so it really, you need to take a second look and maybe communicate more clearly to make sure that you're understanding what they're saying.
I know that some of this might seem like just kind of basic information or maybe something like we're getting into the weeds of information, but we just really see this as something that's important and kind of going on today in conversation, that it's important to establish the basics. It's important to establish what everything is held together on, so that we can understand and see where there might be some problem areas too. Speaking of problem areas, another practical aspect of argument that you might already be aware of, but it's important to understand, are logical fallacies. These are errors in reasoning that will weaken your argument and in most cases undermine it completely. We think it's important for two reasons. First of all, it will help you not to use them, and so weaken your own argument, but then also it may help you to be able to see where illogical reasoning is being used so that you can be aware of it or call it out. And actually, I kind of find logical fallacies fun because it's kind of like a game. You can kind of like, once you learn and you see that, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Yeah. Once you know about these logical fallacies, then you just see it in so much conversation that it's really helpful when you're trying to process things as well.
Yeah, and these ones that we're going to go through, just so you're aware, they have multiple names. Hopefully we've picked some of the more common names for them, but once we explain what they are, you may have heard of them as something else.
Yeah. And so we're just going to go through a quick list of some of the top 10 logical fallacies that are more commonly used. But just so you know, there's lots more. Yeah. So if you're interested, if this seems like really something up your alley, then you might want to look into more of what the other logical fallacies are. But number 1, circular reasoning. When an argument is restated rather than proven and you end up falling back on the original argument as proof. So circular reasoning, you just kind of keep going back to the original argument. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the second one is called hasty generalization. This is, making sweeping statements without taking in all the facts. Basically, it's overgeneralizing based on only certain facts that you either accidentally or even intentionally leave out.
Third would be the slippery slope. This is a conclusion that one small step will lead to a chain of events resulting in a significant event. This is usually used to argue against even taking that small step, even if it doesn't truly mean that the usual negative event will occur. So if you take that small step, then this is definitely going to happen, this really bad thing. So I feel like we see that one a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another big one is a straw man. This is distorting one of your opponent's claims in order to make it easier to refute. Or it's when someone tries to refute a point that you didn't actually make. So really what's happening is they're no longer arguing along the main argument, and they're sort of in a different argument that is irrelevant.
The next one would be the ad hominem one. This is also another really common one. It's an attack on a person's character or personal attributes in order to discredit their argument. So instead of actually facing the argument head on, you're just attacking the person and saying, well, who are you to have the right to talk about such and such or whatever. But there's also something that's called the reverse ad hominem, or the appeal to authority. And this is used to strengthen your argument. Either tactic isn't going to help you actually address the claims of the argument itself.
Right. Another one is a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. This is an argument that presents only two choices as conclusions and disregarding or ignoring any other options. It's often done purposefully in order to narrow an argument towards one person's favor. This is also called an either-or choice. It doesn't take into account all of the potential conclusions that could be drawn from an argument, and in fact, it often tries to lead someone away from drawing their own conclusion.
The next one is appeal to emotion, and we see this a lot. We had a whole thing we talked a little bit about emotionalism and stuff like that. So this is another really common one. That's when the writer or speaker often uses emotion-based language to try to persuade the reader or listener to a certain belief or position. That's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah. Another one is an equivocation or a doublespeak fallacy. This is when a key phrase or term is presented in an ambiguous or sort of double-sided way. with one meaning at one part of the argument and a different meaning in another part of the argument. This makes the argument misleading, and often the change in meaning is not made explicitly, and typically that's done on purpose so that you don't know that meaning has changed. I mean, this is the very essence and use of linguistic theft that we've talked about earlier. So it's really important to precisely define your words and to be careful to be consistent in the way that you use them.
Mm-hmm. Another one is bandwagon appeal. So this is an appeal that presents the thoughts of a group of people in order to persuade them to think the same way. For example, well, all these people think this, so you should too. This could also be reversed as well, to place someone into a negative group of people and therefore attribute motive based on that grouping.
Mm-hmm. And the last one that we're going to go over is called a false analogy. This is when two things that really are completely unalike are being compared on some sort of very trivial or small similarity that's really not relevant to the argument. Really made you do this in order to support your conclusion, but you can see how that's very weak and not aligned with making a good, reasonable, logical argument. So, like us, you may hear these fallacies and hear them explained and realize that you hear certain ones all the time, or that you hear all of them all the time in today's social discourse. And it actually seems that postmodernism's attempt to throw away logic has only led to an increase in the use of these logical fallacies. And they're being used as a way to almost replace logic, as if they are the better way of reasoning than true logical arguments are. But if you'd like a better explanation of these fallacies and some good examples of each one, I encourage you to check out the video that we have attached to the resource section of this episode.
So also then, if you are interested in some more resources for logic and how to defend an argument well, there's a couple people you might want to check out. That would be Frank Turek, John Lennox, and Greg Koukl. Frank Turek has a website that's called crossexamine.org. He has written several books and does many speaking engagements where he debates atheists. John Lennox is a professor of mathematics at Oxford University. He's also a speaker and an author of several books that interface science, philosophy, and religion. And then there's Greg Koukl, who wrote several books, including one called Tactics, where he explains some tips on how to engage people with differing worldviews. I'm actually more than halfway through that book at the moment. In the beginning, I didn't really like the book. Basically, I didn't like the title of the book because some of the tactics, I guess, I kind of saw as something that inherently, if you are a Christian, you want to display, you want to listen, but you don't do it because it's a tactic. You do it because you honestly care about somebody and you want to know their heart and you want to basically understand them better. And he so I didn't really like the title of the book at first, but then the more that I'm reading it, the more that I see that there's actually a lot of really good points he has for certain situations you might find yourself in, like if you are in a classroom with a professor who's basically targeted you and using certain tactics in order to make you look stupid. So like, what do you do in those scenarios? What would be a good way to kind of maneuver through those kinds of situations? So at first I was like, I don't know about this book, but now kind of like reading it a little bit more, I think that it might be something worth reading. Mm-hmm. But also just, I'm unaware if logic and critical thinking is really taught in schools currently. But as we've stated before, it's really important just to help our children know how to think and not just what to think. So if you're interested in looking into some books for your children on logic, a good one to look into is called The Amazing Dr. Ransom's Bestiary of Adorable Fallacies. I know that sounds kind of funny, but I can't take credit for this one because it was actually another great resource referred to by the Browns. And it's just a cute way to introduce the idea of logical fallacies at a young age. Also, you could find this book on logospressonline.com. And on this site, they also have some more advanced logic books if you are interested in looking more into it. And so if we could just leave you with this one more thought of encouragement. We've been stating a couple times recently, and it's been noted in the last couple interviews, that teens are asking the question, why? They are more skeptical and they want answers. And I don't think that they are the only ones. The more that we are told that there are no real answers, or that the answers are only subjective, the more that I have to believe that people yearn for something that's actually solid. I think this gives us incredible hope if we can actually help them see that there are legitimate and logical answers to their questions. So with those answers, though, we need to make sure that we respond in the right way. It's good to defend our faith courageously, but as James 1:19-20 states, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." As we explain the question of why behind things, we have to also keep in mind why we're having the conversation in the first place. It's to bring God glory and draw others into an understanding of who Christ is. So let's make sure we display that rightly.